We have with us Dr. Srajana Kaikini, who is an assistant professor of philosophy at the School of Interwoven Arts and Sciences at Kriya University. Her PhD is from Manipal Academy of Higher Education. She trained as an architect at RVCA and has done her master's in arts and aesthetics from JNU with a diploma in curatorial studies from Riapel, Amsterdam. She was the collections curator at the KK Hepper Gallery and Arts Center from 2016 to 2019. Latest independent curatorial works include Backstage of Biology at Archives at National Center for Biological Sciences 2019 and Vectors of Kinship 2016 at the 11th Shanghai Biennale. Her writing has been widely published across magazines, newspapers, and journals. Recent publications include The Aesthetics of Risk in Artistic Practice, What is at Stake, from 2020 to 21, The Necessity of Understanding Disasters in the Language of Suffering, Curating Interdisciplinarity in Literature Art, Resonance in Dhwani Aesthetics and the Deleuzian Logic of Sensation, The Return of the Translator, and many others. She dances, sings, creates, designs, curates, writes, and teaches by way of doing philosophy. She loves the sea. Since ma'am currently lives in Gokarna, to avoid any disturbances due to weak connectivity, we will be playing her presentation that she recorded yesterday. Ma'am will be available in today's session and will participate in the Q&A after. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Arivu. Yeah. Thanks, Salila. Thanks, Madhuri, for inviting me.
Thanks for joining us.
Play it, yeah.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and play the video now, okay? Yeah. Is it visible? Can everyone see this, guys?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
So what do I do now?
You need to play it, I think.
I don't know where, because it says stop presenting. Let me try this one more time. So maybe I need to, okay. Just hold on, guys, just a moment. Yeah.
Hi, everybody. Such a pleasure to be.
I think it's not visible, sorry.
Oh, okay, just hold on, sorry. It's visible now?
Yes.
I don't know why I'm not able to play it when I...
There is a triangle there, play button. I think if you press that, it will start.
Yeah, but I don't see the triangle.
Center, right in the center.
Center, is it? Oh, okay. Yeah. It just keeps saying stop sharing and hide. That's all, but it doesn't.
A space bar may also help. Maybe you can try the space bar sometime.
Okay. Sanjeev, are you around? I think I might need your help with this.
Salila, if you present,
yeah,
and where you're able to see that hide, saying that you get that message you're presenting hide.
Yeah.
Just hide that button, and you'll be able to see that.
Okay, got it. Now can you see?
Yes.
Yes.
Wonderful.
Hi, everybody.
Sorry.
Yeah. Such a pleasure to be back at RV College to be speaking with my alma mater. I did my architecture there, and then of course I went on. So I'm very delighted to be speaking to all of you. And I mean, today, as part of the discussion, I'll be just discussing the ideas of what it means to do interdisciplinary work, drawing from my own work, my own practice, and the various hats that I wear. And so I hope that, if you have any questions, please feel free to engage in a discussion at the end of this. I'm pre-recording this bit because I'm very unsure of the internet stability that I'm on the coast, and it's quite stormy. So please bear with this recording in case it is used. Thanks. This So let me share my screen and then begin. Yeah, so I've titled my talk today as very simple. What's the process? Right? It's something that I keep asking whenever I see anything. Uh, Whatever you see in front of you, the final product. I mean, often it's so easy for us to consume it. We forget to ask, what is the process behind it. So only then, perhaps, we can begin to understand what a method can be or what a method can be defined as, right? So I'm completely coming from a philosopher's standpoint of knowing nothing and trying to dig at the foundation, right? Completely, at the basics of what does it mean when we're talking about something to become a method? What does it mean, especially as this is a research method symposium? What does it mean to engage with the research method per se, right? And I will be sort of bringing together my own interest in the entanglement between theory and practice. Currently, I teach philosophy at at Kriya University at the School of Interwoven Arts and Sciences, and again, the focus there on our teaching is on interwovenness, something that we're trying to really work on as a larger teaching principle. So that will be something that will keep coming in the background, right? So, I mean, to begin with, uh, there are various ways in which we can dive into how we engage the world. For me, it's extremely interdisciplinary, and here are these four large buckets from which I would say that the perspectives or experiences in this world are coming to me. And so, if we were to understand what they do, we are all very well versed with these things, right? There is the arts, there are the sciences, and then I have taken that extra step to add design there. It's rarely, taken seriously as a discipline in its own, but we'll come to know how it's so powerful as a way of engaging with the world. So the third discipline is design, and the fourth as philosophy, which is sort of the grandfather discipline, when we say. Uh, so when we start to look at artistic practice, right, and what does it mean to be creative? Okay, when and so I'll go back to when I decided to do architecture. If you remember, we had our CETs and entrance exams, and it was just a lot of a flurry of sort of a competitive, nerdy environment where you're supposed to excel. And I was almost going to do my medical degree, and then suddenly I decided, wait, no, but I'm also so creative. I want to do various things that were already, ongoing at that time: music, dance, drawing, painting, like all kinds of sort of creative exploration. So I was afraid that if I took up medicine, I would have to, give them up. So I sort of, on the last minute decision, went and took that architecture entrance exam and then got through and was at RV for 5 years. And I must say that it's completely changed my outlook. The way in which I look at the world is really foundationally augmented by my architectural training. So, but I came there with this sort of thirst from the artistic background. So I loved science. I trained in the sciences for my 11th and 12th, but I was missing a thorough creative, engagement, a thorough a place where I can unfold my creativity. And somehow I thought architecture would be a safe middle ground where I can sufficiently deviate, but not too much, right? Because we are still really mired in our sort of colonial inheritance of education, where the arts folks and the sciences folks never speak to each other, and something which should now be actively breaking and dismantling. So, if art is a that kind of mode of engaging with the world, where you are creating new realities, or imagining, speculating, or even reflecting all the things that can be, where possibilities and the world of possibilities are at their highest power and potential. We do have the sciences, which are more interested in giving a faithful account of reality, of the world around us, what the world is made of. So physics will give you an account of the set of cause and effect. The biology will give you an account of what we are made of, how we function as human beings or as a living species. And so generally the interest with the sciences is this engagement with what is, right? Existence. So isness is something that keeps coming in philosophical engagement. But in the arts, we can say that it's interested in what can be a little more. And design for that matter, which is again, this sort of, it sits at this interesting threshold between arts and sciences. And so I would call it an augmented perspective on reality. So this can be how things are, right? So there is such that power of possibility is entangled with the power of existence. So that so creation is trying to inform reality. Reality is trying to inform creation, right? And here, what role does philosophy play in relation to these disciplines? I would say the grandfather role, right? Because historically speaking, the scientist, even Newton, was called a natural philosopher, and so you know, and eventually over Enlightenment during the Renaissance, the bifurcation happened where the natural sciences became a different discipline, and philosophy took its own course academically, right? But then the main question or the search or the focus of philosophical engagement with anything, with art, sciences, design included, is to understand the nature of something, to understand the nature of reality per se, how things are, what they are, and so all that can be and how they are, right? So it is a coming together of possibilities, of existences, understanding of the way in which things are, and also the processes behind it. So all these things coming together to get that larger picture and to get a better understanding of it. That's what philosophy tries to push at, right? And so definitely we are here dealing not just with naive realities and engagements and experiences, we are engaging with something more than what is, right? And here, the image that I've used is from a project that I thought will be apt to introduce or talk to you about in this context, which is where, it says more than what you see, right? And it's a relic of an instrument that we found in the lab of National Center for Biological Sciences in the RVCA lab, which is now converted into their archives. So we're trying to play with perception and perspective, right? When we are trying to dive deeper into any discipline, through any practice, including architects, designers, scientists, artists, teachers, yeah, a philosopher, and so on. And so this project, for example, was very interesting. I was working with a team that I often work with. It's co-curated by me and Meera Bainder. Meera Bainder is a philosopher, environmental philosopher. She focuses a lot on ecological discourses as well as discourses of biological sciences and philosophy of biology. And I worked with the architect and curator and designer Naveen Mahantesh, who also happens to be the alumni of RV College. And so together, we completely transformed the space. We came to the space as where it was an abandoned lab of obesity, and let's move this so you can see all the images clearly. And what happened was this was supposed to be the opening exhibition for the archives, and I thought this would be a nice project to just talk to you about, because the this is where all our different hats came into play very nicely, very cohesively. The space had to be transformed. So architecturally, we had to bring in design interventions into the space, which was a former lab. So this was not intended to be a designed gallery space, right? It was something else, and now it will be converted to something else. So what would that entail? The second was we were working with a completely unorganized archival treasure house. It was a set of objects, random things. Here you can see these instruments, these test tubes and slides, a lot of fascinating slides, documents. So the greeting card that you see here of this woman that is drawn by Homi Baba, and it was a greeting card sent by Homi Baba to Ubaid Siddiqui, who was the head of this lab, whose work is very widely known for their work that they've done on the fruit fly or the Drosophila, right? So we're trying to now bring a very drab, inaccessible institutional history and convert it into an experience. So my practice as a curator, for instance, has been to make experiential these different entanglements. And I've been very interested because it's not simply working with art objects here. We were working with institutional history, very intangible, and objects, random objects, which are everyday objects. You do not know how to contextualize it. What would they give or do to your experience, right? And then in the end, what turned out in this project was that the room became a blackboard, and we decided to, populate it with hashtags and chalk writings and accommodating text, but also this illuminated center stage where things were illuminated in very playful ways. So we were trying to play with the ways in which science operates. Science can be made accessible to everyday. So the focus or the thrust was on trying to make science accessible, experiential to people who were not necessarily initiated into a scientific understanding of anything. So why I got this, talking about this is because here we were not just working with the what is, we transformed the what is through our design intervention, but then we were very faithful to the what was, because that was our commitment to bring out or bring alive the archive in a way that is faithful to what it stood for, as well as what can be, right? The what can be is again a way which we are not in control of. We put things in relation to each other and things start unfurling. And the what can be is the most powerfully manifested by the audience or the perceiver. The possibility is complete only when the perceiver comes into the picture of any experience, right? So, so here, this would be like a fantastic segue into then the classic conundrum that we all engage with when we're dealing with any kind of in-depth study. And this is something we did not necessarily dwell on in architecture undergrad times, but then of course I have to deal with it in philosophy, but then it comes in a greater force when you're in a higher education, when you're doing a master's, MPhil, or a PhD level, where suddenly all these questions about your research are asked. And at the heart of most of these is the tussle between the subject and the object, right? And now to be very clear, what is a subject? What is an object? Of course, we have entire philosophy canons around these ideas, but an object is a simple object, something that is graspable, something that you can see, you use, you move, something you can, break, you can do something with it, right? As tangible. Let's focus on the naive idea of the object. And the subject is something that you can, somebody who engages with the object. So the subject has a consciousness. The subject is us, or even other creatures, other living beings, and so on. And so this long-standing tussle is then, also entangled with methods and ways of research. And each discipline, for example, uses the method or uh, engages with the subject and the object with different commitments, with different priorities. And I would say that each discipline or its sub-discipline are themselves ways for doing research. So as an architect, I can adopt a sociological way. As a philosopher, I can adopt an anthropological method. Or as an artist, I'm going to adopt a scientific method, right? So think about disciplines themselves as potential methods. That will be something that really opens up our way in which we look at methods in any work. And so here, ontology, epistemology, phenomenology, right? These so ontology will be very simply something that deals with objects. Epistemology, something that deals with knowledge. Phenomenology would be something that deals with experiences, lived experiences. So they are constantly playing a very key role in our engagement with the world. So, for example, I will keep coming back to architecture because that's one hook that I want to address. In architecture, we engage with it. We already are in it, and so we're not aware of it. We're already doing user experience studies. We're already trying to make a set of what the user wants, who are the users, why are we doing this, ergonomic studies. So we're already engaging between this whole subject-object relation, but we aren't necessarily reflecting on how or why we're doing it. We're just doing it, right? So it's first praxis heavy, and then perhaps if you take that time to think about it, that's when the beauty of it emerges. But also very critical to the subject-object relationship is that ethics becomes extremely important. And in disciplines like design, not just any discipline, for example, but disciplines like design have a lot of power in what they can do. So when design is moderated by an ethical antenna, that's when the design precisely can use its power for bringing about meaningful change, I would say. So very simply, if you're looking at object, this is a work by Joseph Kossuth at the MoMA collection, and it's called One and Three Chairs. It's very self-evident, right? You will see one physical chair, an image of a chair, and the description or the dictionary definition of the chair. And then, so when we are trying to then unpack the subject object here, usually I do it with my students, but here I'm just going to take it. The students definitely engage with it very well. First way of looking at it would be the object-centric view, right? Where all of these are objects. Each object is a different kind of object. One is an idea object, one is an idea of the object, one is the artwork of the object, the tool of the object, or the image of the object. So all the signs are referring to the same point, the same object. So essentially, it is that one chair that is being talked about, right? So that is an object-centric view of understanding something. Now, there would also be a subject-centric view. And the subject-centric view would say that this person would look at the object as an image, that person would look at the object as a tool, and so on and so forth, right? So we have a complete multiplication of the object, if you want to talk about it in that radical term. The object is very plural, very multiple. There's no one singular object. And so amalgamation of this is where we are looking at intersubjectivity, something that phenomenologists often look at. We want to look at Husserl, for example, who's done amazing work on phenomenology of ideas and trying to understand how consciously, collectively, a sense of unified object can come across with, common to different subjectivities, common to different people. So the object becomes a site of activation of relations. That object is one object, but then it is engaged by the subjects in various ways, and language, for example, signification, language, semiotics, semantics, all become extremely significant and critical to how the object is looked. Now, these, in fact, are subconsciously, implicitly, always guiding the ways in which we're engaging with, our subject matter, anything. So if you look at your research that you're doing, if you're a PhD student, you will be employing this. you're doing interpretation of work, you're gathering field data, you're trying to capture or gather inputs from their various sources. So you're trying to multiply, pluralize your subjective inputs. At the same time, you're trying to reason out. You're reasoning out a hypothesis. You're trying to make a convinced argument that is trying to be as objective as you can in order to make yourself communicable to the other, right? So relatability is possible when that object has a common ground, right? And understanding is possible when you share the same subjective language. So here again, I'd like to just very briefly on this project that I did for the Shanghai Biennial some years ago, and it's called Vectors of Kinship. And this is precisely, a very relationally oriented work. Because as part of my PhD, I've worked on the ontology of curatorial practice, which means trying to understand what curation does. And as a thesis, I'm focusing on relations and the role of relations in the formation of any object. So here I just gathered a lot of conversations, inputs, ideas, even works that were trying to engage within the idea of relating creatively to whatever world they want to relate to. So we had a philosopher like Sarukai talked about the idea of the object, very basic, what I'm doing now. But then also we had someone like Meena Kandasamy voicing her rage, at the memorial for Rohit Vemula through her poetry recital, and her object her object of fury was very clear. It was a nation itself, and then and the system that of a system of oppression that it resulted in that culmination. Or we had Irene Kopelman, a very sensitive artist from Amsterdam, who was talking about the world and how she perceives it in fragments. She works with natural material, with forests and so on. And all of these very silently and sort of, in an incipient way came together on a table. They were not exhibited as objects. My intention was that to kind of demystify this whole object theory, objectifying theory, trying to make it more relational, more processual. So it was a table where people could sit, gather, spend time, a library space. What in present day, design language, maybe one we call the convivial space, or a space where people chill or hang out, right? And as a strategy, as an active strategy, engaging with the art or whatever, the creative engagement, not as an object, but as a process. That was something that I wanted to focus on in this project. And you know why I'm showing this to you, because it connects clearly with the previous one. So very briefly then, why do we research? What is the meaning of research? And so I mean, the largest paradigm that we need to clarify to ourselves when we set off on this whole research trajectory is whether we are trying to invent something or we're trying to discover something. Two are very different paradigms. If you see how they are subject heavy, object heavy, right? If you're wanting to invent something, your onus is on the creative, you're trying to move it to something new. When you're trying to discover something, you presuppose that there is something out there to be discovered. The object is already there, and you are going out there and taking it out, right? So you understand the tension between a framework that is engaging with invention, a framework that is engaging with discovery as a model to guide any kind of research. So, and this is a quote that I'm very fond of. I used to use it even in my bachelor's, where Kulas is saying that people can inhabit anything, they can be miserable in anything, ecstatic in anything. And the more I think of it, I realize that architecture may have nothing to do with it. So the question is, does architecture really change, or do designers, do creatives really change anything at all? I mean, it's an open-ended question. And here there is a case to be made for the notion of imminence. And bringing in Deleuze here because Deleuze is extremely, has a lot of affinities with architectural thinking. His writing is extremely spatial, and of course his idea of the fold is very popular with design and architectural minds. And here he's trying to propose a shift in the way in which we look at the world as not a world of cause and effect, right? That would be the discovery module. But then a world where we're looking at action and effect, where if something happens, how does that affect something else, right? So for him, lived experience becomes that paradigm that enables new relationality to emerge and has that power to transform our reality. And that is the larger philosophical paradigm of imminence. So imminence versus transcendence is what is usually talked about in philosophical discourse. And imminence is that which belongs to this world, which is lived, it is experienced, it is sensed, we understand it. It is right there, and it is not determined by us already. Right? It is something that we encounter. We don't know about it. We are going. So it sort of inspires us to be exploratory by nature, and where I see the architectural imagination and its power coming into play. It's one is that it has the ability to speculate, but one from grounded in reality, and the power to bring about ethical change is extremely high in disciplines that are focused on transformation, right? And architecture itself is a metaphysical hack. So once we start thinking architecturally, we have already gotten a bird's eye view. We've moved away from our first person narrative. We've moved into a slightly universal narrative, slightly something where we're able to see things from different angles. And so it is that ground where possibilities get entangled with what is, right? So you're creating realities for people. So it is that, it is extremely philosophical in nature, I would say. So, and here I would want to spend some time, a little bit of time, we're running out of time, but on interdisciplinarity. And so often interdisciplinarity is really like passed off as saying, okay, no, it's fine. You just bring in some bit of that, some bits of this, some sociology, some geopolitics, something. Oh, yeah, interdisciplinary. But no, it's hard work because concepts are moving across a lineage of histories that are progressing in their own ways, right? So you're trying to shift and bring in concepts from various disciplines, putting them in play with each other. And so for the language of lines, words, sounds, touches, intangible things like memory are coming into discussion with language of caste, class, gender, race, geopolitics, identity, power, and also of feelings, of aspirations, as well as time, space, absences, right? Because that is exactly where you can't move so fast. If you were just going in one discipline, you will reach the end line very quickly. But because of all these intersections, we go very slow. So it happens that the work may be extremely deliberate, extremely, different in pace, but it is covering more ground. It is doing a much more in terms of changing how it moves knowledges themselves and knowledge systems, right? So many forces are at play. And here, that's why methods and choosing methods to move forward in whatever you do becomes very fascinating. In fact, the box just opens up with that many more options. And intersectionality, that's a new buzzword, right? But nobody really takes that moment to look at what it was doing when it was coined. It was coined in 1989, and it was a way for Kimberly Crenshaw to talk about the oppression of the African American women. So all of these, they are nodes, you might say. They are different forces, and when we are trying to explore interdisciplinarity, which is actually the very natural state of the world, I would say. It comes easily. We are easily interdisciplinary. It takes a little more hard work to focus on only one thing because naturally things are connected, right? So that's why I would end by saying that ways is a nice way. When you're talking about research methods, in fact, we're trying to just talk about the various ways in which we may try to reach from point A to point B. Or maybe set up from point A, but end up at point D because you have been perceptive all through and trying to be true to the process, right? So the line becomes blurred. Do you choose your method before you set out to do anything, even design, for example, or even your practice or your research work, right? Because I mean, if you're a researcher, you're expected to give in this whole very charted out plan. It will never turn out that way. So is it a choice or you're following some norm, which is something that is already, it has to be done this way, right? And the lines are blurred. So, but what we do understand that the praxis and the theory do inform each other. They go hand in hand. Unless you experiment, you will never stumble across something new. Because the final limit is a limit of your knowledge. You would know only so much as you would know. Unless you put yourself out there and explore for an encounter, that limit of your knowledge system will not get expanded. So that's where praxis becomes extremely important. And for example, I mean, the methods at playing and engaging the problem are very close to the problem. If you listen to your problem well, half your solution is at hand. So in philosophical inquiry, for example, we always say that half our battle is won if we arrive at a good inquiry problem. If the question is good, you're almost there, right? So I would just say take that time to ask that right question. And there's a varied array of ways in which one may look at doing practice, doing research, exploring, breaking out of the box, breaking that glass ceiling, and so on. I mean, I've just written down something that came out of my mind, but then they all play a role. So you can do it conceptually, you can synthesize field work, you can empirically observe things, you reason out, use your practice-based experience, you're creative that bring that focus in, you're true to archives or history, you do archival research, you can speculate, you can reflect, you can even research on methodology, right? So your work can be on finding a new way. That is like the ultimate meta work that you can do in a way. So I would just say, listen very sensitively to what you are doing, how you're doing, in whatever you're doing, and keeping it as universal as possible. Because when you listen well, what you're listening to will give you a lot of cues. And if you take those cues up and move forward, that becomes a great synergetic experience to come together interdisciplinarity, engage with the world across disciplines, and sort of hope to shape-shift boundaries that otherwise may constrain us. Thank you for your time and thanks so much. Questions, welcome. All right, thanks so much.
Thanks, Rajana.
Hi, thank you. That was an interesting presentation. You literally sort of threw a lot at us to sort of think about, and that's my daughter. And I was just interested in how you, throughout the presentation, you set us on this sort of a dichotomical path, if I may say so, where you never really sort of directed us or the students to say, hey, this is the right path, go about it. You sort of highlighted the fact that there's always going to be this duality to the process itself. And I was intrigued by the fact that you mentioned ethics in design, you mentioned hard work, you mentioned interdisciplinary work and intersectional work. So I would like to sort of elaborate a little bit more on that. I'm sort of intrigued by this idea that as a designer, you have that both a moral compass and an ethical power to work with, to sort of lead on. How do you, just elaborate a little bit more on that, because it's very rare to see designers speaking of their process from these springing points.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I'm not able to see you. But thank you so much, Deepa, for that question. I mean, I think the question of ethics became even more to the foreground once I started reading up a little more, philosophical works and so on for my, postgraduate work and so on. Because when we did ethics as undergrads, we were taught codes of conduct. What you do. All I remember was if a building falls, I'll go to jail, and that gave me like sleepless nights. So I'm like, oh my god, this is like huge responsibility, like I'm going to kill somebody if I don't do it nice. So but then what does it actually mean in terms of even the subtle layers of design? I recall we were made to design a chair. Anuradha ma'am was there, and I was like, that simple exercise of how do we design a chair and what is it made for? And at that time, we don't know, we just do it. But actually, it is like extremely, has large implications of how it can change our lifestyle. I mean, if relationality becomes the primary framework, then it's about conscious design. It's about, you do the design only when it is needed. It is not about you do design because it's your job and you get paid a lot, because that's where a lot of I mean currently a lot of engagements, controversies happen when suddenly some steps are taken and then the intervention or the consequence of these may not be completely at hand or perceived. So an ethical lens sometimes just helps you maybe go slower, but take all views into consideration and then move forward. It just makes it more meaningful, I would say, in terms of the value that the design has at the end of the day. And of course, I mean, product design is at the heart of capitalism and the economy and the market economy and profiteering. You do like very, very simple, like small writing, reduce the size of the font on your product in a very strategic way, and you know what it does. It For 2 days ago, Cristiano Ronaldo avoided drinking from that Coca-Cola bottle. It's and that's an action design strategy. I was like, that's it. It has extremely like a butterfly effect of how it affects the world, the economy, and so on. So I mean, if you want to look at it as a something that you're giving back to the world, something that is not just a job, something that not simply creating or generating. Sometimes you can work on reducing, work on doing something else. Like I remember having very good conversations with, because I deviated from architecture, I moved on to art and curation, but I still used to collaborate with, I think Aliyeh also knows Ankit Bhargava, and he works with Sensing Local, and working with the intangible, trying to not really work on ground footprint, but trying to reduce footprint, reduce impressions, carbon, environmental consciousness. So I think if it's a need of the time, I feel, because yes, we can do many things, we can create a lot, it can go unchecked, but then like Spider-Man says, with great power comes great responsibility. I think architects are very powerful. We just don't realize that, and we use the word architecture in other disciplines as well. So the software, they have like your coding architects. Ambedkar is the architect of the Constitution. So it's a social word that way. So when I wish I had actually. So at undergrad we do things, but then we're not reflecting on how powerful what we're doing, and what is. And so it's just nice right now at this moment to be able to get or draw meaning from that, and sort of also see where we can calibrate, to give back to the world. So that's my small two things. Like they are big questions, very difficult. The stakeholders that are involved when any project is going on, the kind of push and pull that happens. So if these Antony are already inbuilt right from the go during pedagogy, I think a lot can be done in the future as well.
Absolutely. I
Was I
really
audible?
hope, yeah, you were.
Okay.
I really hope that our students feel quite empowered with that. Thank you so much for the presentation.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Thanks, Rajana. I was very excited and happy to see those two words, ethics, and the last line, especially. Getting the question right is just more than half the battle won. And I think that's one thing we've been talking to our students too as well. What is your question? And it's okay to spend a lot of time on it, but as you said, once you get that right, you at least are on the right path. And then, as the other point that you made that was so important was getting from point A to B. I mean, just the starting point, and then you don't know where you're going to land up. And I think that's extremely, and that's being comfortable with that is, I think, very important. It might just feel a little disconcerting, you expect that you're going to land up at a certain point, but then you get somewhere else, and being happy with where you went with it, right? So thank you so much. I think now we can open the floor out to the audience if they have questions. We have about half an hour, so yeah.
The audience must have great stamina to survive 3 hours of.
I think we have a question for Aliyeh from Sandeep Nagraj. So Aliyeh, Sandeep asks, you began with hope of return, or as I see it, quoting, a yearning for return. And this reminded me of a lot of songs embodying the same. Did your study involve songs or the study of soundscapes as well?
Aliyeh, you are on mute.
Aliyeh, you're mute.
Still mute. Please.
Sorry.
Yes. All right.
Yes, now I'm meandering through the uncharted terrain of Google Meet. So I've been asked this question a lot about songs, about poetry, and I've not worked with that yet because what I'm doing right now itself is really vast, and I think they have, but not me specifically working on it.
Thanks, Aliyeh. We have a question from Deepa Suryaprakash also. She says, Deepa, do you want to ask your question?
Hey, I was throughout when you were talking about the walks, I was wondering which part of the city you were doing it, and naturally you answered it later saying that you're restricting it to old Bangalore or the Kabban Park area, So I was also wondering that, much like Mansi spoke about and all, you also mentioned how the people of these areas are actually not perhaps happy, or they want to grow out of the representation in the way they are seen or identified with spatially, objectively, image wise, etc. So when they are actively looking at their success as erasure of their own identity, both from lifestyle, from the space they live in, etc., does that leave like huge patches in your story building exercise? I assume it obviously does. And when it does that, are you looking at sort of extending your boundary? Like, for example, now does Jayanagar and say Malleshwaram become part of the old Bangalore? Does the periphery increase for you? Are you planning to increase it? And I was also wondering that what defines a story as a good story? I mean, in terms of the age, like when we speak of old Bengaluru, are we talking about like a 200-year-old history, or 50 years is good enough, or 25 years is good enough? So I just want to know your thoughts about, probably just growing out of this little core that you are in, and how do you see it coming?
Okay. Initially, as a history writer, my work was confined to historical structures, monuments, artifacts that come from the past. Largely, it was the old city area and localities that have historic value. But I think some of these questions that you raised were very beautifully answered when Arzu and I started working on the memory maps project. And that is actually a methodology that starts with walking through the locality. And it's some localities were very new. And when we had participants signing up, they said, oh, but we have just come in 3-4 days ago, or we've just come in 2-3 years ago to Bangalore, so we don't know the history. At that point, we realized that we tend to believe that history is something, very in a linear way, something in our dim past. But when we explained to people who were signing up for the workshop that even coming into Bangalore through the airport yesterday, and your 4 hours in the city, the 1 hour drive from the airport is still memory. It's still yesterday. So when we did a workshop for the IIHS for their festival 2 years ago, Sadashiv Nagar was the focus area, which is a relatively new locality for us to map. And Arjun and I walked through that area repetitively. And for me, I think, and for her, it was finding hooks for stories. Similarly with Malleshwaram, when we started at the MLA ladies I'm just blanking out a bit. So when we started there, it was not about the fact that Gandhiji came there and the ladies threw in their jewelry and so on and so forth. The question that we asked the participants was, it was about women, and it was about women in spaces, and it was why did these women throw their jewelry in, and how did they have access to education? Who were the women who lived in Malleshwaram at that point? Were the old families all Indian civil servants who had access to tutoring and education, allowed them to stay in touch with what was happening in India at that point? So coming back to Sadashiv Nagar, there were questions we asked like, why is it still primarily residential? Why is it that it hasn't given way to multi-storied apartments? Who's living in these houses? And I think through the practice of that workshop, we have gone over the boundary of history and heritage and gone into meaning making, which does not really depend on age.
Thanks, Aliyeh. We have a question for both Aliyeh and Mansi from Salila. Salila asks, you mentioned taking back your research to the communities after documentation. Any specific examples of their responses that you would like to talk about?
Yes. Actually, I have a few favorite stories. One of them is the mural at the Tikpet metro station of the Karaga. And that is really, it's a long panel that spans the entire, it spans 3 walls as you come up from the stairs. And I think the entire project for Tikpet was very evocative of this re-embedding that we are very keen to do. So when one day we were just sitting and we were watching when it was done, people who were coming up the escalator with their suitcases, when they came to the part of the Dharmaraya Swami temple, they would suddenly drop their suitcases and everybody would bow to the mural and then move on. And it was beautiful. And then we had the authorities, I heard that the authorities from the Dargah came, and the authorities from the temple came to see whether the 2 places were adequately represented on the mural, and then they gave their approval. When you came out of the station, there's this entire mural by Abhimanyu, which represents the area, because the walking, the impression collection, everything was about an inside-outside approach to place. And so for days, there were people standing there wondering why the cows, the handcarts, things that we saw along the way, they could recognize themselves as owners of handcarts, shop owners, people just sitting by the road that the artist saw and collected and transferred onto those walls. Initially, there's always this question about why are our lives significant enough to be visibilized like this? And I would like to quote Dr. Satyaprakash Varanshi from INTAC, who once said at a talk, he said, the thing about Bangalore is that what the tourists find spectacular, the locals find ordinary. And so this visibilizing, this inside-outside approach and this re-embedding from the books to the public art, I think is one step towards that pride of place and bringing stories back very meaningfully to people.
Mansi, you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think in the case of the furniture project, it wasn't just about taking the research back to the people who we had interacted with, but by creating this open source platform, we realized that we had intentionally, unintentionally started making connections to communities across who owned and who had inherited such objects. And I think at some point, what started happening was the office landline would continuously ring, and we had these young people from Punjab calling up and saying that I have my grandmother's sanduk, which is lying in our ancestral home in the village, and looking at the value, looking at the intangible value that's associated with it, we want to restore it and keep it to preserve those memories. And they started phoning to ask us about craftspeople, if we knew any who could help repair these furniture pieces for them. So I think for us, the joy was in figuring out that there were these associations that people were able to make, and in the process, a sense of preservation of memory was happening through furniture. So for us, the experience has been that. So it's not just directly with the people who we had interacted, but in a way, almost bridging the gap that exists between these decontextualized objects to communities and people across.
Yeah.
Mansi, we have a question for you from Guru Prasad. So what he asks is, have you come across any furniture that has evolved to fit into the urban context? And do you think any vernacular furniture would fit the urban context? Guru Prasad is one of our students.
Okay. I think I'll go back to the point that I was saying. That was one of our initial realizations, that it wasn't about the rural versus the urban in the case of the vernacular furniture, but rather the questions that we needed to ask were about use, about people, about everyday practices, and of course climatic conditions and geographical context. So I wouldn't say that something has had the need to evolve in terms of being reappropriated to an urban context, but if you take the example of a hitchco, which is a swing in Gujarat, it's mostly used in an urban context because of the kind of urban heat island effects that get created, the fact that the place is already hot and dry, and in summers there's not even a wisp of air that you will feel. And the idea of a swing actually developed because people wanted to just sit and be able to create that flow of air. And that per se doesn't really have to do much with whether it's a rural or an urban context, but rather the larger, scenario of climate, geography, and everything. So, yeah, you will see a lot of. I think pretty much every house in the cities in Gujarat, you will end up seeing a hitchco. So there are, I think, pieces both, in rural, urban contexts, which are similarly used, mainly because of the fact that they are dependent on the way the activities and cultural aspects of people in these places.
Thanks, Mansi. We have a question for Srajana. Srajana, thank you for that great talk. The question is broken into two parts. This is from Vivek Kumar Radhakrishnan. The first part is, you spoke about subject and object. Could you comment on the significance of relation as a category in creative work? The second part is, to what extent is perceiver or audience important in the formation of art object or design object in comparison to the designer?
Thank you. Thank you so much for the question. I mean, they're critical to the way in which we practice or look at anything. I mean, in my work, I'm really focusing. So, in philosophy, for instance, under various metaphysical categories, we have substance as a category, relations as a category, cause and effect as a category, and so on. So relations is, when we look at categories, it's like it's a repeat piece of a jigsaw puzzle, without which the jigsaw puzzle will never be complete. And so when we're looking at relationality distinct at itself, it's like glue. I mean, we have this glue theory. So relations are like glue, and without the glue, two things will never be one, right? So that is the key role that relations play in when we are looking at any kind of object. An object is distinct because it is relationally different from another. So the relationship that is active in order to distinguish an object is that of difference. And Deleuze works a lot on the notion of difference and repetition. So the relationality of being different from something, distinct from something, is playing an active role in the constitution of an object. So here, for example, the figure ground figure ground map that we have, it's very critical in trying to outline the definitions. And I think as designers, as people who think visually, this is very it comes easily. I think for those who think verbose or through words, maybe that sort of ease with which relations come to play, maybe a little distance. It's something I'm just like speculating, but that's to answer the role of relations, for example, in the constitution of the object. And of course, subjects are, the identity of a subject is also constituted by relations. So when you're looking at subjecthood, relations are playing a role in defining what identity we are alluding to, or we are ascribing to, or we choose, right? So that's the part one. The part two is something I forgot. What was it? Could you remind me? Because I can't see
Um,
it in my chat.
yeah, part two was to what extent is
Yeah, yeah.
perceiver audience important in the formation of art object or a design object in comparison to the role of the design?
Right, right. No, I think it is crucial. I mean, an object is an object only because perceivers are present. It's like the Heisenberg principle. When you switch off the light, you never know if that object is the same or not. Like it's only when the light is on that you know that object as it is, and that's attributed to the lights being there. And so we're all different kinds of sources of light that are illuminating the object in different ways. So I would say the perceiver is critical. That's why I began with perception and perspective. So, but the point is that the perceivers is in relation to something outside. So there is a possibility of that relational universal. Otherwise, we wouldn't understand each other. Like there is common ground on which we can operate, right? So that is where the we come together. The perceiver is co-creating the art objects. That is one theory in art theory that we talk about in aesthetics, where art object is not out there; it is co-created by the art perceiver. So that's very briefly about that. Yeah, I think was that, and also about the question I see in the chat box about the NCBS work. I think Salila put it. Yeah, it was well received. I mean, we had a lot of. It was the opening exhibition, and I think the idea of turning the whole room into a blackboard with a lot of chalk lying around people, and something that is reflected in Aliyeh's method. I saw that. It's that very handy, things that you want to scribble on a wall. The wall should be scribbled on. Do it. So those kinds of design interventions were something to make it interactive, because technically institutional history is very drab, I would say, to engage. I mean, if you don't bring it alive, uh, for an outsider engaging with anything, if you go to any standard museum, it will be extremely inaccessible. There'll be a bunch of things, there'll be captions, and you can engage with it or not. But then if you want a little bit more, again, what the strategy Leah uses, the lingering strategy. How do you make people linger? Those are all sort of subtle, mobilizations. So we did have this space where people could hang out. There were books there which we curated and put in the space. There were some set of audio archives that were also there for people to listen to, and there's ongoing projection that was changing its visual material every week. So that is where, they were invited to play their own movies when they want. The students could go and hang in there. So it became a different kind of space apart from an exhibition per se. So that is the answer to that question. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Srajana. Thank you for that. We have a question for Aliyeh from Brinda, one of our students, where she asks, how does the idea of returning to home connect with nomadic communities who are constantly moving to different places?
I'm going to find this one a little tough to answer because I don't work with the communities and I can't speak for them. My explorations are so confined to the city. But so I think I'll have to pass this one.
I think a lot of times the idea of home also comes from some of the objects. So in a way, I was also beginning to wonder whether this would also connect, with Mansi's work, where in fact I was wondering, for example, especially with the communities that you have worked with, Mansi, you see that, there are a lot of nomadic communities which have sort of specific pieces of specific pieces which sort of work with food culture. So did it also extend to the idea of furniture design that this idea of being peripatetic extended to nomadic communities as well?
Yeah, I think so. I think the fact that you see so much diversity of furniture, there's stories that you can start answering about so many aspects of society. And particular to this idea of nomadic communities, when you look at the Maldharis, the pastoral communities in Gujarat, uh, um, they when they move, the charpoy is a crucial piece of furniture that they end up carrying with them, and sometimes they carry the entire charpoy as it is on the camelbacks, and then whenever they're resting, they actually plonk it diagonally on a surface and use it as a space to rest underneath. And in some other cases, what we've also realized, when people move and objects need to move with them, there are mechanisms that are involved. Now, with the same case of the charpoy, the practice is for the carpenter or the suthar to make the legs of the charpoy and the frame, which are sold to the family differently as different parts. And often it is the family who actually weaves the webbing onto the charpoy. So what ends up happening in such scenarios is that they simply just dismantle it. If you notice, a lot of charpoys are made with a tensioning end where you can simply remove the webbing or the straps that are used these days. So they simply sort of remove the webbing, they take the wooden legs and frames with them, and wherever else they move, they would redo the webbing altogether. So yeah, I think there is
I just, Meera and Mansi, I would just like to add, because what interests me is displacement. And it just came to mind that I was having a conversation about a year and a half ago with a student in Delhi who was working on an exhibition of a very long ethnographic project with the Afghan refugees of Lajpat Nagar in Delhi that she was working with. And in that conversation, she mentioned that almost all of them, when they had to cross the border and resettle in Delhi, their connection to home was exactly this. It was utensils that they brought with them in buses and trucks. There was nothing else that they could bring. And so the idea of that exhibition that we eventually very broadly crystallized was the idea of choice. What is it that you leave behind? What is it that you take with you? So in terms of, it's not just, then it moved on to not just about objects, but about people. So when you have space when you have to leave your home overnight and you are at the bus stop and there are 20 seats on the bus, 18 are taken, and you have 4 people in a family, who do you put on the bus? So the entire exhibition was worked around the trauma of choice. And what is it that you take with you and what is it that you leave behind? And so I just remembered that almost all of them that she said they chose to bring their kitchens with them.
It's really raised the goosebumps on your hand.
Yeah. Who would, yeah, it was a tough question. If you have just 2 seats and your 4 family members, who will you choose to put on the bus?
Thank you, Ali. Ali, there's another question for you from Archita. Archita asks, by its actions, the body makes private spaces of dwellings distinct from the public. Since what constitutes as private and public is also culturally rooted, could you tell us the ways in which the action of the bodies emphasizes the transitional spaces between private and public domains? And is appropriation of the transition space a way of redefining a person's spatial representation?
So for me, one of the most significant spaces of transition between the private and the public, between the inner and the outer, is the threshold, the idea of the threshold. And that is where the word darga comes from, actually, because in Persian, dar is, that point of where you are, and gah so darga is actually the threshold where you walk over between the spiritual and the material world. And that is one embodiment of transition for me. And I didn't catch the second part of the question.
Archita asks, I'll just repeat the whole thing. She says, by its actions, the body makes private spaces of dwellings distinct from the public. Since what constitutes as private and public is also culturally rooted, could you tell us the ways in which the action of the bodies emphasizes the transitional spaces between the private and the public domain? That is the first half. The second half is the appropriation of the transition space a way of redefining a person's spatial representation?
I just wanted to add to the previous idea as well. So it was the darga, the threshold, and it's also for me the kate, which is what the memory maps project is based on. So just the action of sitting outside your house in that transitional space, reading a newspaper, threshing grain, indicated that you were available, to speak for casual conversation. And when you look at a kate as well, the public and the private merge there. You don't know this person who's sitting there. Sometimes kates become bus stops, and you're just sitting there, and then you have this person with a suitcase next to you, or someone stops down the street and talks to you. There's a very deep intimacy to that conversation, and then you pass on, and you don't look back on that moment at all. So I think for me, those points of the body in those transitional spaces where this idea of public-private, inside, outside, are these two very, very strong points of transition. Yeah.
Thank you. I think, Mansi, the question for you again from Archita is, the talk started off with a lot of furniture being encompassed as part of the build. How much of the furniture in your research was permanent in that way?
I think it's important to understand what permanent means, and I would, I think again it's probably an approach which Srajana has been talking about to look at ideas which are relational to each other, and therefore defining permanence as something that can be very relative in many ways. Well, there are a lot of inbuilt pieces of furniture that you see, but also to go back to the example of the larder I showed, the Kotlio, which is unique to Barmer and Jaisalmer. It's often one of the first things that's built in the kitchen space while the house is being constructed. And also the last thing to be left behind when they move from home to home. As we know, vernacular houses are not permanent in so many ways. So when they move into a different house, which they have constructed for whatever reasons, that's something that they will not break, or that's something that they will not destroy, as a sign, as a symbolic gesture towards the fact that it has held their food all those years. So and then that's left to deteriorate and then go back into the earth and waste. So so whether that's a sense of permanence that we're talking about, or let's say, pieces that migrate into collections, even though they're freestanding, they obtain a sense of permanence in many ways. So and then get preserved. Though probably, if you look at it biographically, it's not perhaps its original life that it has led, or its own transient lives that it has led, but it eventually ends up in a permanent location. So I think the idea of permanence is something that can be interpreted in many ways. But if it's just a question that was intended as something in the tangible sense of things, I would probably say not much. Because even when you look at the inbuilt furniture pieces, what happens is, like in all these vernacular homes, they have this practice of painting the house during Diwali in Hindu homes. And when they do that, all the woodwork in the houses, all the furniture in the houses get painted in similar colors, like in the case that I showed earlier. Their chest would be painted in the same colors as their windows and doors. So it's almost like every year it obtains a new identity visually and physically. So I don't know, it's hard to say what's permanent in that sense.
Actually, I had sort of probably a follow-up on that, because I was also wondering about a lot of our vernacular spaces, work with the idea of multiplicity, with each space functioning differently at different times during the day. Did you begin to see the same sort of idea of multiplicity, applied to furniture as well? Because it especially struck me that it, when there were spaces that were allocated to store water, it seemed like of course, water is a luxury, and it only seemed fitting that spaces would be created to sort of celebrate that luxury. But did you begin to see that pieces of furniture, worked with that idea of multiplicity as well?
Yeah, very much. I think the fact that, there are examples like the charpoy again. I think it's a classic example to turn back to. But, if you look at examples such as the low seat, which I think here we call mane, or in Gujarat and Rajasthan, it's called patta or a patlo. So a patlo ends up being used in the mornings to sit and wash utensils and clothes, and through the day, the same a patlo would perhaps be used for the woman to sit and cook in front of a chulha. And then the same patlo would perhaps be used for a child to be sat upon and bathed. And these are, of course, in homes where, the affordability is lesser, where they probably can afford only a piece of patlo. But in some other houses, you end up seeing that there are patlo made for each of these different uses. And that's probably in a span of a single day. But I want to return to the example which I ended with, the pata in Bikaner. And the reason I want to go back to that is I want to, link up what Srajana's concluding thoughts were, this idea of intersectionality and why it's so important in research these days, and the idea of asking the right questions. I think with furniture research, what happened for us is that every time we asked a question differently or posed a question differently to understand furniture, new answers began to come out. And in the case of the pata, what happens is that though it's a piece of public furniture used in the landscape of the old city of Bikaner, during the day it's used for the men to come in and sit down and have a chat and do all kinds of things like play games and everything. But when across the year, when there are festivals, the same pata becomes a space for street theater. So it becomes a stage for street theater. And it becomes a space for music performances where people end up sitting on the pata and performing. So it takes on different roles during different times of the year. And now what happens when you start bringing in this idea of intersectionality to it and you ask different questions of it? We realized just by observing that the pata were used only by men. Like we could see only men using this piece of furniture. And then we began to sort of
ask people as to why and what was happening. And then the stories that came out was, back in the day, this, of course, in Bikaner, a lot of merchant communities, and they were traveling. The men in the family were often traveling. And the elderly men who were part of the community would end up sitting on the pata as a means to sort of watch over the houses where there were no men who had gone off to, travel on for work, and there were only women in the family. So it was almost like these ideas of gender, social structure started coming out. And so embedded is this idea of gender in the Sparta that even to this day, when street theater has to be performed, women are not allowed to get onto it. The men dress up as women and perform. And of course, with practices of parda in Rajasthan, the women are also expected to put on their ghungat when they walk in front of the pata. So it's almost like the structures of gender and social hierarchy get embodied in the object itself. And I think that's where I found Srajana's point so interesting and so relevant, that when you start asking the right questions and when you start looking at things not just through the lens of disciplines, but through this intersectional approach, the answers that you get are so much more deeper and in a way it starts bringing the larger pieces together.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mansi. One more. We are at the last two questions. One for you, Mansi. This is from Anupriya Saxena. So she says she thanks you for a very engaging presentation, but she also says that I was a bit surprised to know that there is not much literature from history that would have our vernacular furniture described or named as it is called here. Maybe I always assumed it would be there as it comes naturally to me. For example, pida, patra, khat, khatia, charpai, etc. So it was very interesting to see the connection of furniture you showed with respect to culture. And she also adds, she says, I come from a village where different types of charpai are made for birth, marriage, and death in the family. So she wanted to ask if you came across these kind of small family-owned private museums people have in various parts of the country, like the Kelkar's Museum in Pune. She recently came across this museum near Chettinad, in a village near Chettinad, where people donate their furniture and have well-maintained records of the furniture. So, if you began to see sort of private family-owned museums, because they had sort of furniture that was demarcated for different cultural events across the lifespan of a person.
Thanks, Anupriya. Yeah, I think even we were quite surprised when we didn't find, academic material, academic content on furniture, particularly because it was so evident. But I think the reason perhaps was that people writing at the time were less interested in the everyday lives of people, and also the ways in which or the language in which furniture could be interpreted was perhaps very different for people who were writing these. And of course, there are people who have done some work. Like I think for us, Jyotindra Jain's work was a turning point during the research, where he had documented a lot of these pieces. But back in the 70s, when he was doing research for the Shreyas Folk Museum, which is again, a museum that similar to the one that you're talking about. And whether we found such museums on field, yes, but not to the extent in which the Kelkars or the Shreyas Museum has been maintained. A lot of families are putting in efforts to hold on to these things and objects as a way to preserve. But I think to do it from a more museological approach also requires funds and a whole lot of logistical issues that can become difficult for private stakeholders. So perhaps not very well maintained. Some, yes, of course. I think when you go to Punjab or Rajasthan, you end up seeing these spaces like Sada Pind, where it has been turned into a hospitality place where you can go have a meal, and there is this whole sense of performativity that comes with, showcasing culture in a certain manner. So, but yeah, there are lots of people putting in their efforts to preserve their own family histories and heritage.
Thank you, Mansi. I think the questions we can ask can go on and on. I have the last question for the evening. This is for Srajana. This is from Ari. Ari asks, you spoke about architecture having the power to bring in ethical change and the Deleuzean idea of inquiring along action and affect and not cause and effect. Architecture is usually reflective of the vision its patrons have for their society. Of late, our spaces are not as democratic as our system claims itself to be. How do we address this issue?
Yeah, thank you. Very important question, Ari. Ari, who, no? The one who introduced me.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Yes, the whole idea of this whole stakeholder business, right? And it's a word that's sort of co-opted by corporates and co-opted by a particular set of people. But I think it should be more sort like, it should be owned by everyone, even what is at stake is exactly the stakeholder business. So who's got a stake in projects and why, right? So if you understand the very nature of stakeholdership, we then realize you can actually democratize it, because if people actually realize that, okay, there is a stake involved and their views actually have an impact in how something can shape up, then they start acting. There is an investment in the project. Otherwise, usually what happens, the stakeholder is often just equated with whoever puts in money. And of course, money is one stake. There are various stakes involved, right? So livelihoods are a big stake. Lifestyle is a big stake. What is your vision or a collective vision for a community is a big stake. So if you're trying to work on a project for a community, you have to identify those stakes very clearly. And the loopholes are usually at the stake level. So if you want to contest a project, you first look at what is the stakes, that what are they furthering, what are they working on, and then there you can catch it. You can if you want to question something, right? So I would say that first, understanding what is at stake is very critical for everyone who is invested in something, and then sort of acting on it. And of course, when you act, if you ask the right questions, often if it's very convincing, so the other person must listen to it, right? And of course, when it is a different game at play, then you take resort in activism, you take resort in legal systems. There are infrastructures that will come to your rescue if something is being completely wronged. I know these are ideal. Real ground reality is very tough to maneuver, and you have to develop a certain kind of stamina. But the more collective this agenda is, I think the stamina grows. I've been watching Guardians of the Galaxy, and they all are like 4 people with a lot of power together. So we are Groot. That sort of there should always be there. Because not a single person fighting, you can't do it. You have to have a collective investment in something. And then discussions, conversations, educational. Your classroom should become your hub. You should actually engage with what's happening on ground in your classroom space, so that your projects can be around it. If somebody's actually designing something, you do it in your own classroom environment. How would you have done differently? It's one sense of empowerment. You feel like, okay, I would have done this way. These guys are doing it that way. You have a reflective parameter as well, in terms of, okay, if I were in their place, maybe I would have done it differently. So just beginning to think about these become very critical, I would say. And then, yeah, sometimes they work, sometimes they don't, but it's all a process. So, yeah, that's my half optimistic answer to it. Thanks for the question, though. I hope you're doing good work. Good luck with your class.
Yes, Ari is in our design studio this semester, and she is definitely, the question comes from her own thought processes, which is quite involved in her works. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, Meera, I interrupted you.
Yeah. I think you're muted.
There's one last question from Mansi. From Nishi Pujari, where she says it was wonderful to hear that the project was not just about documentation, but ultimately gave back toolkits and frameworks for the community to use. So she says she wanted to understand what the focus was on in the making of these toolkits, or even the methodology that led to it.
So I just want to say that these toolkits and frameworks are not directed directly towards the communities, but anyone who could be a practitioner for research. Second, I think in the making of toolkits and frameworks, not just limited to the furniture project, but the entire research at the center has been based on converting practice into frameworks. And for us, the process is not one way or the other, but the two, like research and the development of frameworks and toolkits, happen as a parallel process, because one can't define the other. And then when you go out on field, there's so much you discover, and it's not always possible to anticipate or know, much like what we've learned through this project. So it's often research practice that gets turned into a framework in the kind of work that we do, because it's driven out of work we do with the communities, and you can't bring in a theoretical idea and say that this is how we will do it. That doesn't transpire on field. So I think I would say it's been a process in the reverse, in the conventional sense of how toolkits are applied. So it's always working with the communities, basing our projects, research practice first, and then it gets translated into methods. And these methods are not a constant either, because I think with each step you have to keep evolving.
So I think we've kind of gone through all the questions, right? And we are probably going to stop at this point. Dinesh says, thanks. I feel like a kid in a candy store of ideas. Dinesh, don't you want to ask anything? Your last chance to.
Ma'am, I would just, I think it's for all the three.
Bhakti, just a moment. I think Dinesh is saying something. Sorry. Yeah, Dinesh.
It just depends on how much time we have really, because I actually have some concerns which
Dinesh, you're not very audible. Sorry, I can't hear you very well.
Can you hear me? I'll pass then.
You can type in your question if you wish. Sorry, Bhakti, please go ahead.
First of all the three talks were very insightful, and I really enjoyed all the three. I have a question for all three of you. So, how would you relate experience, I mean an individual's experience, to research methods? I mean, in points where Aliyeh spoke about, how they map the experience of each and individuals to understand the space, and then when Mansi spoke about the vernacular and how the space, the experience in the space changed, and for Srajana about how experience helps us get a right question. So I would like a comment on how experience and research method can intersect.
Who'd like to go first?
No, maybe I'll just quickly respond and you can take on. Thanks, Bhakti. Who asked this question? Bhakti asked this question.
Yes.
Yeah, ultimately you are creating a new experience when you're engaging with actual practice, right? But even when you're doing some research, then you have to ask what you're doing that research for, correct? And so if you're doing, it is all guided by that. So sometimes your research may not be really dependent on experiences. It will be completely a logical work. I'm talking about general research at all, completely, in terms of you need not have any on-ground input. If you're working on a mathematical equation that will change the structure of some material, that will change the structure of something, that is also research, right? But if you're looking at transforming, if the object of your research is experience, then experience has to inform your research, right? So it is if you're setting out in order to add something or modify something or transform something through that knowledge system that you're making or engaging with, which will change the way in which something will be felt, experienced, understood, right? There, you'll have to begin also with how it was. Otherwise, there's no change that you can bring about, right? So, experience becomes your ground point from where you begin. You think differently, add a new knowledge item or whatever thing that you do with your research, then that same experience is different. In fact, when you're doing your research, you'll have to demonstrate that your hypothesis or thesis is valid. Through this, you have to demonstrate how this actually works out, and this is, or if you actually experiment, does it work, or you sort of like do sampling and so on and so forth. So there are the in normal parlance, you would say qualitative, quantitative, right? So experience constitutes your qualitative data in whatever you're researching. So consider it as material for your research. Experiences form that material. So that's, but if, again, I'm not saying it's always there. Some people need, mathematicians don't need, from what I've seen, they just, they're very happy with, non-experiential things, but you can also argue that mathematics is experiential and so on. So it's guided by what that question is, again, if I thought a research question. Yeah.
I think I agree also, Srajana, because for me, Bhakti, the thing is that I see what we do and with walking as a practice as a prelude to research. So the experience is what leads to the research rather than coming into space to test a hypothesis or to look for something, which is the intentionality. So working with the body in space means, like I said, there are two things over there, and one of them is like allowing for. And I think that we largely work with that allowing for the unknown, which then informs the known, which comes next. So for me, it would be that experience leads research, because I'm always a step before that for someone that I choose to work with or in my own work as a writer. So even if it's a design studio or I'm working with the group starts with the experience that then informs their research or the lens that they want to look at the area from.
Yeah, I think Ali and Srajana very beautifully said what the connections are, and I think with the kind of work that we do at the center, and I personally have been doing, we've realized that even with experience, there are various forms of experience, right? One is your own lived experiences, which helps you figure out your own positionality in the larger scheme of things of what you're researching. Then there is the learned experiences, which for us, when we're doing field work, you're constantly learning and you are experiencing things, which then informs the next step of research.
Yeah.
So I think this positionality and this lived experience helps you set out the intention, but what you discover through the research also comes a lot through the learned experiences. So I think, there's a lot at play in terms of how you begin to understand your own experiences and how you choose to apply that to whatever you're researching.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bhakti, for that question. And I think on that note, we will close today's session. Aliyeh, Mansi, and Srajana, can't thank you enough. Those were just amazing. And I hope our students are that much more enriched, in thinking of their own work and not thinking of theory and practice as very different things, and I think you've beautifully demonstrated through your own work, just by walking the talk, that there's not such a huge gap. And it's really excited about listening to you and what your work, and really excited about tomorrow also now. So we hope you join us tomorrow. And I want to thank Meera and Deepa and Ari and Diksha too, and for conducting this event so beautifully. Thank you so much. And finally, thanks to our audience. Have a lovely evening.